today. John, good morning to you.
G'day. Yeah, on Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. So Trump's strategy has been, or the Trump team strategy has been to let Donald be Donald, and Kamala
John, just hold on a second. How do you know what the Trump strategy? This is your opinion, right? Not you don't actually have any factual basis.
What I was going to say is they had Kamala Harris. She was in a hotel or something, and they practiced over and over.
Yeah, that's probably not news. I think there's a fair bit of rehearsal for debates. Yep.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that Trump's strategy, where you get kind of a real person speaking from the gut, kind of it didn't kind of match her polish.
How do you know that was his strategy, John?
Well, I'm just guessing.
Oh, okay.
I'm just surmising that this is how it worked. And for instance, like when he said about they're eating cats, there is some truth in that. I think.
Is there?
I think they're eating ducks. Well, I saw it on YouTube, and
look, just stop right there, John. I saw it on YouTube. Is that your burden of proof, mate?
Well,
that'd be like the Polkingthorne trial. The lawyer would just stand up and say, look, here's a YouTube, he did it. And bang, he'd be guilty, right?
Well, you can't always don't have time to go source, but this is something...
Well, no, John, here's the whole problem with the modern world. You just don't know.
But it doesn't mean to say it's all wrong, but it seems...
No, John, it just means that you can't guarantee it's true if it was on social media.
Yeah, well, okay, but given that point...
so why, John, are you bothering even to have an opinion on it when it's not based in fact or reality? It's just what you saw on YouTube.
The point I was getting to was that Donald Trump shouldn't have used that. He should have mentioned, for instance... that,
John, I want to stop you again. Why would you make this point? Why is it relevant for you to have an opinion on it? We've already established it's based on the internet. You have no idea if it's factual, and you having this opinion will make no influence into the real-world outcome of that election, right?
Well, yes, but I was just mentioning it because that was Donald Trump's strategy. And I was
but John, why do you care about Donald Trump's strategy? Haven't you got better things to do with your life?
Well, the same issues apply here.
Because Donald Trump isn't running for Prime Minister or as leader of a political party here, so they don't.
Well, basically, the division between, on the issue between Donald Trump and the Democrats is one issue, and this is well documented.
Well, it's not well documented. You saw it on YouTube.
It is. No, yes, I saw, but I saw a debate between Eric Kaufman and Applebaum of the New York Times.
Okay. And now we're down the rabbit hole, John, aren't we?
No, he's a data-driven pulsar academic, and he presents his...
Where did you find that out, that he was a data-driven pulsar academic? Where did you read that?
Well, he says he is, and then I follow...
And where did he say he was? Where did he say that, John?
Oh, okay. Well, this
on the internet, on the social media.
It was for journalists. The Faith Angle, it's called the Faith Angle Forum, and it was about national populism. Okay. And they had two.
John, that's all fascinating. That is all fascinating and completely meaningless, John.
So normally we basically ground rules and jump right in. But again, just want to say a few things because Faith Angle is new here about the project before we talk about national populism. In the States, about 20 years ago, a wonderful predecessor, a guy named Michael Cromartie, sort of took this on, in part because he sensed that there was a disconnect between journalists and religion. I think one time he took a call from a reporter in D.C. when something was changing around gender, and the reporter said, okay, you're telling me all these things, especially evangelicals, this book, Ephesians, or rather Galatians. Now, who's the publisher on that? Where can I get a copy? And so he was sort of thinking, this is an opportunity here to reconnect. The idea is that, especially in the States, where we're something of an exception to the secularization thesis trend, high religiosity, that there's a disconnect between elites and religion, between journalists and mainstream religion, heart of the country especially, and that lurks beneath a number of the stories that journalists are telling. So maybe an opportunity to shore up some of that disconnect. Race and religion, race and immigration and ethnicity as an aspect of this, Eric Kaufman. I think there's a handout with Eric's remarks that should be before you.
Yeah, and I apologize for being the quantitative poli-sci academic, so hence the slides. But I just want to say I'm not going to be anywhere near as wide-ranging as Anne. I'm focusing strictly on the West. That's Western Europe, North America, Australasia, and also only on right-wing populism, not on left-wing populism. I think there's a really important frame for this, which is the global demographic revolution, which is really about the unevenness in global population trends around the world. So 97% of the world's population growth is taking place in the global south, the tropical belt, which is obviously non-European, but also highly religious, and the source of most of the immigration present and future for the West. What that means is a dramatic shift in the ethnic and religious composition of Western societies. And this is ultimately what I'm going to be arguing is behind the rise of right-wing populism. If the West was like Japan or Korea, we wouldn't have right-wing populism, pure and simple. It is about immigration and ethnic change. Those changes are going to be dramatic. Already we know in the US, the shift from a population that was about 85% non-Hispanic white in 1960 to what is projected to be only 50% of the population non-Hispanic white in 2050. That same process is occurring in New Zealand and Canada, both of which will also become majority-minority around 2050. Canada, where I'm from, actually has you can look at the dramatic, there was a projection by Statistics Canada demographers that showed in the year 2006, the country is about 80% European origin, 20% non-European. 100 years later, in 2106, those proportions will be roughly reversed. Now, that's not everywhere is going to move as fast as Canada, but what David Coleman, the demographer, calls the third demographic transition towards this complete ethnic transformation of Western societies, I believe is the backdrop for what we're seeing in Western, not necessarily the East, which we can come to later, although I can talk about that, but this is why we're seeing right-wing populism in the West. And immigration is very much a symbolic lightning rod issue because it unsettles the identity of ethnic majority groups and also people who are attached to the nation, but part of their national identity is the ethnic composition, the historic or the ethnic composition they've grown up with. So someone might be Hispanic living in the United States and be attached to a conception of America that involves a white majority, oddly enough. And so if we look at Latino Trump voters, for example, there's a poll done after the Charlottesville riots, which I produced in my book, where 70% of Latino Trump voters agreed with the statement that whites are under attack in America today. That's 70% of Latino and Asian Trump voters. The same percentage, by the way, as white Trump voters. So this idea of the sort of ethnic transformation of nations is ultimately central to the story, and immigration is very much the issue. The other issue, which I'll also talk about, is the so-called turn of the left from more economic, class-based appeals to more identity-based appeals, which I think is also a very important part of the story that hasn't always been examined. So I'm going to look at that a bit. I'm going to start, however, with this issue of what's driving right-wing populism in the West. And the very basic message here, similar to what Anne was saying, is really not the economy. It is really about immigration. And I'm just going to look at a couple of charts here. The first one comes from the British election study, which has a sample size of over 24,000. So this is an incredibly large sample. This is taken after the Brexit vote. And we ask people, or the British election study asks, did you vote to leave the European Union? That's on the vertical axis from 0 to a 0.8 possibility of saying of somebody voting to leave the European Union, and on the horizontal we have your views on immigration from allow many fewer at 0 to allow many more at 10. If you in Britain said I want many more immigrants, your chance of voting leave is about 0. If you said allow fewer immigrants, which is a much larger group of people obviously, your chance of voting leave is above 8 out of 10. Now, we compare that to these different colored income bands. So if we want to look at the economic side of things, yes, it's the case that the blue line, which is poor British people earning less than £15,000 a year, are somewhat more likely to vote Leave than people earning £60,000 a year or more in yellow. But if you look at the distance between that blue line and the yellow line, that's only a 10 or 15 point difference. Whereas the gap between allow many fewer and many more is 80 points. And that's in Britain where we can get some kind of an effect on income. So essentially what we see there is that your attitudes on immigration are vastly more important than your income in determining how you voted in the referendum. Not only that, by the way, your attitudes on the death penalty are vastly more important than income. Your attitudes on child rearing, strict or permissive, are about 4 times more important than income in how you voted in the referendum. Now, we could have changed income to class, to job status, to anything material. Those material factors really do not play much of a role in that Brexit vote. Something very similar in the Trump vote on the next page. If we look at the American National Election Study, the predicted probability of voting for Trump in 2016 against views on immigration, this is an even sharper story. If you believe that immigration should be increased a lot, your chance of voting Trump is only about 1 out of 10. If you believe that immigration should be reduced a lot, it's over 8 out of 10. So similar scale effect to the Brexit vote. And now if we look at these income bands, there's nothing there at all, nothing statistically significant. And this is, by the way, controlling for age, income, and party ID. So essentially, in both cases, it's an immigration story, and income, the economic factor, isn't playing at all. And we could go through different European populist votes. You have to look at the individual level data. I really think there's a lot of problems are caused by people looking at election maps, which are incredibly misleading, or looking at any kind of aggregate level data. Cities have a lot of people who don't vote for populist right parties because they've got a lot of immigrants. They have a lot of people in their 20s and a lot of people with advanced degrees. If you actually strip that away, for example, white working class Londoners are as or more likely to have voted Leave as white working class people in any other part of England, the most remote part of England. So it's not really so much anything about London's economy or its international atmosphere. It's just what kinds of people are living there. And so this idea of where your populist vote comes from is very psychological, very individual. 25% of 2-person couple households in Britain had a split on the Brexit vote, and half of 4-person households had a split on the Brexit vote. So this is not about regions or economics. It's about actually the psychological level of how individuals are wired. I'll just give you an example when it comes to immigration attitudes. This is from UK data, the next slide, where it says, how much do you agree with this statement? Family over everything. And we're only talking about 18 to 29-year-olds. If you are in favor of much tighter restrictions on immigration, you endorse that statement 73% to 18%. If you're in favor of much looser restrictions on immigration, you oppose that statement 50% to 35%. An absolutely massive difference. And that's kind of getting at some of these psychological dispositions around attachment to family, to group. A lot of this is about attachment to ancestry and to majority ethnic group. Another good question, which is again from the YouGov Profiles data, which has about 40,000 sample. I usually go to the same place on holiday each year. So what might that have to do with your immigration attitudes? Well, it turns out this is a very significant predictor. If you favor much tighter restrictions on immigration, you are 10 points more likely to say, I go on holiday in the same place each year than somebody. Now, if we look at those who say, I favor much looser restrictions on immigration, by a 3-to-1 margin, they disagree with that. They're going somewhere different on holiday. Now, this is not a factor of income. This is 18 to 24-year-olds, upper middle class, white British. So we're controlling for the economic, for the age, ethnicity, and we're seeing a dramatic difference. And what that's getting at is a bit of what Jonathan Haidt writes about, which is that you have these differences which are about 50% genetic, actually. Pew did a study, just some of the twin studies. What's that?
It's from Karen Stenner. Jonathan Haidt gets it from Karen Stenner.
Right. But Karen Stenner, so there's Karen Stenner, who I'll talk about in a minute. But also, Pew did a summary, I think, of some of the twin studies and showed that these attitudes, which are sometimes referred to as right-wing authoritarianism, which is a preference for order and stability over difference and change. So if you see diversity and difference as disorder, as opposed to interesting, or if you see change as loss, not as something stimulating, right? And that is a heavily genetically conditioned and heritable disposition. And Stenner talks a lot about this in this great book, The Authoritarian Dynamic, which means that these attitudes are unlikely to be easily shifted by some appeal to people to embrace diversity. Actually, what Stenner shows is quite the opposite. They will often react negatively to that kind of an appeal. And so we have these kind of deep psychological structures. Some people like difference and change. Other people dislike difference and change. That filters through to immigration attitudes, which then filters through into populist right support. Again, this next slide, death penalty is very much related to some of these dispositions Stenner talks about. And so, for example, if you strongly disagree with the death penalty, then you're pretty happy in Britain, you're pretty happy with current immigration levels. If, however, you strongly agree with the death penalty, you really want immigration reduced dramatically. And that's why death penalty is such a good predictor of the Brexit vote, actually, in Britain. It's also important to note that in the Trump vote, death penalty supporters, Trump got a much higher share of death penalty supporters than Romney did. But anyway, that's something else we can talk about. So the next question is, why now? I mean, if it's always been the case that you've had people who dislike disorder and difference and change, what is it about the post-2014 or post-2013 period that has witnessed this upsurge? And basically, it is largely about immigration numbers. Now, of course, numbers are refracted through perception, but the first thing to note is that people care about immigration as a national issue. They're actually not that concerned with what's going on locally. So in Britain, if you ask people, is immigration a problem in your local area, only 20% say it is. Is it a problem nationally? 70%. It's very misleading to actually say, oh, this locality has very few immigrants. Why are people so anti-immigrant? Well, they're thinking of their imagined community of the nation, not their local community. Now, of course, if their local community is changing rapidly, then yes, that's going to give a shot in the arm to right-wing populism. But most places aren't changing that rapidly. So if we look at the national trend here in the next slide labeled Chart 1, which comes from Ipsos Mori, you can see that along the bottom, starting in January of 1984, we're tracking three things. Immigration levels, something called the Issues Index, which is the number of people who say immigration is their number one or two issue, and media coverage of immigration. And these three trends are all moving together. So starting about 1997, when Blair comes into office, you see a big jump in the numbers of people being admitted into Britain from about 50,000 a year up to 150,000 a year later, and then pretty quickly it's up to 250,000, and then under Cameron it gets to 300,000. As that figure is rising, the number of people saying immigration is their leading issue rises from what's only a couple of percentage points as late as about 1998, and it rises up to reach up as high as about 45%. And that is what essentially is behind right-wing populist support. So this salience measure, it's not, do you want immigration reduced or not? Your attitudes on whether immigration should be reduced are heavily tied to your ideology and some of these psychological orientations I mentioned. What happens with the numbers is it boosts the salience level. So instead of immigration being you may oppose immigration, but it's your number 5 issue. When the numbers go up, immigration rises from number 5 to number 1. And once it rises to number 1 and it's a highly salient issue, that's when the populist right has the demand conditions to thrive. The next slide is really very similar on Italy, which just shows annual refugees and asylum seeker arrivals by sea, news coverage, and immigration. Again, the most important concern for Italy in the sort of green line, and it starts to move up again once you get past the first half of 2014. And then, so turning to the next page, I'm going to try and summarize this in Europe. We have two graphs here, one of which is from Eurostat, which is the European Statistics Agency, And the blue line is the number of non-EU citizens entering the EU. 2013, that starts to move up from about 500,000. 2014, it rises again to a peak in the migrant crisis of almost 2 million before going back down again. And then if we look at the Eurobarometer question on the main concern of European citizens, the black line, which is immigration, moves from about 10% in 2013. It sort of tracks the rise in numbers entering the country, or entering Europe, peaking in 2015, coming down somewhat in 2016-17. So basically, the story here is immigration increasing, which drives up the salience level of immigration in the population. And as we'll see in the next slide, that's very much connected to populist right voting. If we compare the economic crisis of 2007-8, that had no effect systematically whatsoever on either immigration opinion or populist right voting. So this argument that the economic crisis mattered, I think, is very suspect. We have a nice natural experiment. We got an economic crisis, a migrant crisis. What matters for populist right voting? The migrant crisis. And that kind of links up very much with some of that opinion survey data we saw, which in terms of what predicts support for the populist right. Just to come then to the next slide on, there was a paper done by two political scientists at the European University Institute, James Dennison and Andrew Geddes, who looked at this question of the relationship between that salience measure, that is immigration one of your top issues, and support for populist right parties in the polls. And they found a significant time series correlation in 9 out of 10 West European countries between 2005 and 2016, which kind of, even in the case of, you can look at particular countries, like in Germany, once Petri assumed the leadership of the AfD, there's a significant relationship between monthly refugee arrivals and rising support for the AfD. If you look at, so for example, the AfD in Bavaria, 100%, not 99, but 100% of AfD voters in that election agreed with the statement, Germany is gradually losing its culture, whereas only about 20% of Green voters agreed with that statement. So, yeah.
But now the figures for Germany and Austria are slightly exaggerated.
Sorry, are slightly, what's that?
Exaggerated. The AfD never got to like % in Germany.
Oh, sorry, the orange line is the salience of immigration. The blue, sorry, I'm kind of whipping through these a bit quickly. The orange, yeah, okay. Anyway, so I just want to come on to the next slide, which is to do with this question of levels. So there's two issues. One is the rate of increase in immigration, and the other is the level of a particular minority group. Now, I actually don't put as much stock in this issue of the Islamic threat being the driver of this as other people, but I think as a sort of barometer of the rate of ethnic change in a society, it's a useful one, because it's very tough to get good numbers in Europe, because a lot of immigrants in European countries are Europeans from nearby countries, and so it's hard to sort of screen out and focus on exactly which populations are seen as different and as changing the composition of the population. But one thing you can do in Western Europe, again, focusing on Western Europe, is you can look at the projected Muslim share of the population in 2030. So that involves two things. One is the current Muslim share, and the second is the rate of increase in the Muslim share. And if you put those two things together, Pew has come up with this projection. And you can see there is a very strong positive correlation between the projected Muslim share in 2030 and the highest vote or poll for a populist right party in a West European country. So Portugal and Iceland and Ireland, with their small Muslim shares in 2030, are unlikely to have the demand conditions. The demand conditions are not as good for the rise of right-wing populism as, say, France, Sweden, Britain, and so forth. So part of this then is this idea of the change in the population, and what rapid immigration does is it unsettles the taken for grantedness of these ethnic majority identities and national identities, and that's what's driving, I would argue, this trend. And the next slide, which is from Nate Bresnow, who did a blog at the LSE, is simply suggesting that if we continue, given the gradual rise in the foreign-born share in Europe, up now to about 15% in 17 West European countries, you see the populist right. Now, it's not a linear relationship. There are supply conditions, absolutely, so I would never deny that. But we should expect that we are only at the beginning of this trend, I would say. That we should expect to be living with this phenomenon for some time to come, given the demographic shifts that are continuing to occur and are already baked in, by the way, due to age structure. So the younger population, more diverse than the older population. And that means that even without immigration, we're going to see these changes continue. So, and the current projections are actually quite significant. Britain and Sweden are likely to see a tripling of their Muslim share between now and 2050. So about 17% of the UK, according to Pew, whose projection methodology I'm pretty familiar with since I know the people who worked on it. I think it's very sound. So we're likely to see in the UK an increase from 6% Muslim in the last 2011 census to 17% Muslim in 2050. That, I think, is going to be a big question for British politics, not so much the European question. I just now want to, how much time do I have?
Good 5 minutes.
Good 5 minutes, okay. I just want to pivot and talk a little bit about the turn of the left, this shift from more class-based to identity-based appeals, which I think is a very important part of the story. The reason it's a part of the story is because the increased focus on race in particular by the left and disadvantaged racial groups means that there's been what psychologist Nick Haslam calls a concept creep, particularly around the terms like hate and racism. What that means is that a greater sensitivity to and optics of racism means that mainstream parties and institutions have a much harder time in talking about, for example, reducing immigration. If that has a whiff of being unkind to minorities or racism in a climate where the cultural left has increasingly been able to perhaps shape some of the norms of civilized discourse, the kind of Overton windows shrunk, that means the only people who can really address this issue are those who are outside that Overton window. So I use the example of a Soviet department store. If they're only selling one pair of pants, if you want something different, you're going to have to go to the black market. And so if this Overton window is forcing the mainstream parties to only offer one pair of pants, then the only people who are going to offer something different are the populist right entrepreneurs. So in a way, without the populist without the identity left kind of shrinking the space for discussion of these issues, I don't think there would have been the market space for populist right parties in the West to thrive. The other thing we find also, now there's been about 5 experiments that show when you tell people Trump or UKIP's policies are racist, when you use certain terms, that triggers a negative backlash in a section of the people who read that passage. So there's also a direct backlash effect to the use of some of these terms. And so what that's actually producing then is you have an identity left which is moving increasingly in the direction of expanding the meaning of racism to encompass things such as reducing immigration. Sweden is a good case where the interior minister tried to raise the immigration issue in 2013. He was attacked as a racist, couldn't raise it next year. The Sweden Democrats come in on about 13%. So they were able to own this issue because the mainstream parties couldn't. Once the populist right comes in, the mainstream then decides to move on to their turf and can get a lot of that vote back again, but only after the taboo is kind of broken by the populist right. In terms of the interplay, I think it's quite interesting, this interplay between the identity left and the populist right. And I think they're actually feeding off each other to produce a kind of polarization. And we can see it just in this next chart, which was some research that I did in the US and Britain. This is on the United States, though, and asks a question, which I think is kind of central to the debate, which is tribalism racism if you are a member of an ethnic majority? So the question here is, a white American who identifies with her group and its history supports a proposal to reduce immigration. Her motivation is to maintain her group's share of America's population. Is this person, A, to paraphrase Shadi, who I got this idea from by the way of racial self-interest, is A, just acting in her racial self-interest? So it's just rational group behavior. There aren't many white immigrants. The best method for maintaining your numbers is going to be to restrict numbers. So is this just group self-interested behavior, which isn't racist, or is it being racist? And it turns on the definition of what you think of when you think of the word racism, which I think is a very important question. And so we see white Clinton voters with postgraduate degrees, 91% say it's racist. And white Trump voters without degrees, it's only 6%. In Britain, Leave voters without a degree, that number is 0. And so we see this vast difference. It's not just about do you like immigration or not, it's also is restricting immigration, particularly for cultural reasons, immoral and racist. So it's kind of a values-based split layered on top of the split over the actual cultural impact of immigration. So you actually have the left liberal part of public opinion reacting to the populist right part of public opinion, and they're kind of feeding off each other. What's interesting is non-white Americans kind of lie in the middle on a lot of these questions. So ethnic minority Americans, only about 45% say this person is being racist. And even minority Clinton voters, only 58%. And that's true, we find that on a lot of questions where white liberals are most likely to see racism, white conservatives least likely, and minorities somewhere in the middle, on particularly questions of identity. And so on the next slide, we can see what this has done on this hot button issue of immigration. Just looking at white Americans who vote Democrat or Republican, really right up until the Romney-Obama contest 2012, the gap on whether you want to reduce immigration between Republicans and Democrats was only about 10 points. And then suddenly with Trump, when Trump comes in, Trump versus Clinton, you get a 50-point gap. And that's reflecting not just people switching into the Republican Party who don't like immigration, but also Democrats reacting against Trump's rise, going the opposite direction. And now 60% of white liberals say more immigration is what we want. So a real split on this question. Canada, which, by the way, just had an election and the new populist party only got 1.5%. So people are thinking, populism is not an issue. If you look at Canadian public opinion, you can see the same pattern. 5 years ago, there was almost no difference, maybe 10 points between the conservatives and liberals. There's now a 50-point gap between the conservatives and liberals. And in Britain, there's, of course, a 50-point gap on immigration, 40 to 50 points between Leavers and Remainers. So again, this interplay between the identity left and the populist right, I think, is a very important dynamic. But ultimately, what underlies all of this, I would argue, is the demographic shifts of which immigration is an important symbol, and not economics.
And you see what you do, you just say, okay, why do you think that? Why is it relevant? You think that, where'd you get that information? And suddenly, we're just down the rabbit hole. Get off your high horse, says Simon. Ring in and tell me about my high horse, Simon. And I don't mean to be mean to John, but look, it's just an exercise in explaining to people, for F's sake, let John speak. You can ring in and speak. I love it when all the armchair experts come out. John needs to spend less time on the interwebs, yes. Sean, we see the platform on YouTube. I saw a Haitian man walking down the road with a dead goose and a woman bending over a dead cat she had killed, and she's now being charged by police. Are you saying my eyes are lying? Kate, do you know who the woman was? Do you know the circumstances and the context of that? I'm not sure you do. No wonder you don't get any phone calls. Rude. Where do you get your information from? Oh, the internet. But I've spent 40 years training myself to try and discern facts. It's my job. All right. What a morning we're having. And as I said, as I went through that amazing chat with Dave Gerard, Sean, rather harsh there, Sean. Does free speech not apply to your caller, John? Surely he's entitled to express himself and in doing so possibly make a fool of himself. Yes, he is. Perhaps you could let us listen and decide for ourselves, says Neil. Neil, do you want to ring in and discuss it? Feel free, buddy. And John, we don't block John's calls. I enjoy my discussion with John, but John often displays the characteristics of people like Ben, who watch two politicians from a different country debating for an election that they can't vote in and think that that's somehow intellectual or somehow that makes
I don't think it's intellectual.
Makes you politically aware or something.
No, I'm allowed to enjoy stuff.
I mean, it's like all these people who run consultancy firms and comment, and a political commentator's on outfits like Red Radio. You know, they ran the photocopy in Jacinda's office for 5 minutes. Or that guy, Jack McDonald, who keeps on getting quoted and writing columns in the Post, and he's a pool attendant at the Freiburg. I mean, it's just a joke. Just because you know about something doesn't make you an expert. I mean, I love Star Wars, but I'm not a TIE fighter pilot or a Jedi. And I realise that those things don't exist, Ben. 0800 332283. Don't be scared of me. Though I might be in a mood this morning.
Healthy small boys get to be healthy big boys with protein. Bread and Better is a great way to get high-quality protein. Bread and Better, that's what healthy boys are made of.
John, please pass the better peanut butter.
Bread and Better, that's what healthy girls are made of, too.